Let's turn our attention now to Iran, which has seen an 8th straight night of protests sparked by the death of a young woman detained by the country's religious police. Crowds of protesters gathered hours after counter-demonstrations backed by the government. The unrest has spread to towns and cities across Iran. Activists say at least 50 anti-government protesters have been killed by Iranian security forces.
Anger among Iranian women is still raging. They're burning their headscarves in defiance that is unprecedented in the Islamic Republic. It began with the custodial death of Mahsa Amini, a 22-year-old Kurdish woman arrested by Iran's so-called morality police. Dozens are believed to have been killed in the unrest. The protests have spread to cities around the world. Here in Brussels, Iranian women are calling for change in their home country.
The women of Iran, they are not victims, and they are in the street to say, we never been victim. They try to make us as a victim. They try to control our body as an object of sex. They try to control our sexuality, our bodies for their ideology, for a theocratic regime. We are to say we are against theocratic regime. We don't want this regime. We want to overthrow this regime.
Mahsa has become a symbol of the oppression that women have been facing in Iran for 43 years. It's different this time because the country is united and they're all saying together, no more Islamic Republic of Iran. It's the Islamic Republic versus Iran. And we're here to support them, to do everything we can to be their megaphone, to be their echo chamber.
Back in Tehran, the regime is organizing its own demonstrations.
The protesters and rioters that took to the streets are not ordinary people. They are trained groups that have entered our country to destroy the ruling system. We definitely won't allow this to happen.
But there are fears that the state's response could go beyond counter-protests. Iran's Chief Justice called for security forces to respond to any further anti-government protests with force.
We're now joined by Iran analyst Adnan Tabatabai. Adnan, just how significant are these protests, and are they somehow different this time compared to mass protests in the past?
What is really important, I believe, this time around is that this is really about socio-political grievances as the starting point, but of course other grievances of economic hardship and lack of any sort of political representation of the wider population are at the core of these protests.
And what about the response by the Iranian government? I mean, how brutal do you expect them to be? What action do you think they're going to take to quell these protests?
Yeah, unfortunately, the longer these protests are taking, the more violence we see on the streets. I mean, there's a lot of anger in the air, so to speak, and then vandalism happens, other forms of clashes, and the more violent it becomes, the more brutal the crackdown will also be. So we have to expect ugly scenery, unfortunately.
But do you think there's any chance that these protests will lead to any kind of change in Iran?
Look, the one thing that makes me slightly hopeful is that at the very, very early beginning of this, a lot of current and former officials have actually spoken out very critically against the mandatory hijab, or at least its enforcement. So if those voices prevail, and I hope they do, then we may see some sort of gradual changes on that front. Other than that, I'm afraid that these protests will be silenced and then eventually come up again in the next cycle.
All right, that was Iran analyst Adnan Tabatabai. Thank you so very much.
My pleasure, thank you.